I think we'll get started, and a few more people may trickle in, talking into this mic for the benefit of the internet. So thank you, everyone who's here. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Meg Rithmire. I'm the James Robison Professor at Harvard Business School. I run the China Economy series, and thank you all for coming. Today, we have a real treat to have Professor Christine Wong, who's coming here today from a visiting research professorship at the National University of Singapore. She's been in a number of places in her career, Oxford, University of Melbourne. She's an economist who is, I think, I was going to say in my view, but I think in anyone's view, the foremost expert on China's fiscal system. And I wanted to say on a personal note that I was terrified of Professor Christine Wong for the last couple of years. I was writing my dissertation, and the first couple of years I was an assistant professor because I thought she would think that the way I was talking about land was wrong. And she turns out to not be that scary, but she is formidably smart on the Chinese economy. And so we are really lucky to have Professor Wong with us here today. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Okay, so I've been working on China's public finance for a very, very long time, about 3 decades, and I look actually at macro, but I'm mostly known as somebody who knows about local governments for some reason. And so today I'm going to talk about, I will start talking about local governments, but I'm not really talking about local governments again. Okay, but to just provide some background, everybody knows this. To set the scene, local governments play a big role in the Chinese economy. I think this fact is quoted by everybody. Local governments account for 80+% of government spending. It's been 86% for about 20 years. What's less well known is that local governments also account for 80+% of infrastructure investments. And this is a big number because, as you know, China invests a lot in infrastructure. China is an outlier among countries in the amount of infrastructure they do. So an average rich country invests something like 3 to 5% of GDP in infrastructure per year. China invests 10 to 15%. But that's another talk. And local governments have been playing a starring role for many decades because they are the ones who are building infrastructure, they're building industry, investing in industrial policy, and competing in economic growth and pushing the economy forward. But they have been struggling over the last few years, much of a decade. And the problems have been posing as a drag on the Chinese economy in slowing economic growth, but also in rendering fiscal policy pretty ineffectual as China has struggled to raise its growth rate over the past 5, 6, 7 years. Okay. And so I started thinking about local governments and their problems just before COVID. And I started tracking. I hired a research assistant when I got to Singapore in 2020 to look for local reports of teachers not getting paid. Okay. And within 3 weeks, I had to fire this research assistant because the number of cases was just massive, and I didn't need any more instances of it. And so it started with delayed payments to contractors. I've never been to a local government over 30 years where they did not always, they shortchanged the contractors. I don't know who builds things in China because you build schools, you build hospitals, and the contractors are never paid on time. Right. And Bill is nodding, and he's had even a longer history in China than I have. So this is an ongoing thing. And then the first public employees who don't get paid on time tend to be teachers. Okay, so teachers, and then eventually maybe, hospital staff and other people. Increased fines and penalties. We started reading about tax audits enterprises getting 30 years of back tax audited, and getting penalized for selling products under the wrong label, even though the laws changed in the meantime. And then 2-3 years ago, we started reading about local government debt risks rising. And in early 2024, there was a district in Chongqing that talked about 砸锅卖铁. They're so desperate that they have to do whatever they can to monetize their assets. And this is a great leap forward kind of slogan, right? You take your pots and pans and crush them and take them out to smelt steel. And then over the last year, everybody is talking about, deep sea fishing, profit-driven law enforcement. The FT has a big piece, the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, and so on, where local governments go to other jurisdictions to capture and find enterprises to shake them down for money. And there was a case last year where a businessman was abducted in Zhejiang and by some local officials from some northwest province and driven across the border, and he somehow escaped in Jiangsu province and went to the police and reported it. And the police captured these guys, and they turned out to be policemen, but from another county in the northwest. And so this is happening more and more. And so I want to talk about 3 sources of stress. The first 2 are very well known, and everybody's been writing about them. The collapse of land revenues, starting in 2021, when the government introduced the 3 red lines to try to bring leverage under control in the housing sector, developers, the Evergrande case, and so on, that froze finance in the real estate sector and caused a crash in the housing sector and the real estate market. And then that led to a spike in local government debt risks. And the third thing is something that's talked about, but not nearly as much. And I think there's not quite enough understanding of this problem, that there's been a long-term erosion of the government's fiscal position over time. And the argument I'm going to make, and I've made it in a couple of recent papers, is that the problems manifest at the local level, local governments, but the root causes lie elsewhere, and they're systemic, and they're nationwide, and they come from the wider economy, the structure of the fiscal system, and so on. And fixing them will require systemic reform, structural systemic reform, rather than just getting local governments to behave better. So there's a lot of rhetoric about, reining in local governments and getting them to obey the laws and not exceed their exceed their assignments and so on. But it's much more than that. This is a picture of China's budget, revenue to GDP ratio. You can see that it rises steeply from 2000 to 2012, plateaus, and then starts falling from 2015. And the reason for that is that, the rising portion is the rebuilding of the revenue mechanism after the 1994 reform, when new taxes were introduced, the VAT, the corporate income tax, personal income tax, and so on, that allowed the government to capture more revenues. And then China hit this golden period, when it joined WTO and its economy boomed. So economic growth, GDP growth was more than 10% per year. Revenue growth during this period of roughly 12 years, 2000 to 2012, was 20+% per year. So revenues were growing twice as fast as GDP, very high revenue buoyancy. And that's why you have the revenue to GDP ratio rising, right? And then growth began to slow from about 2010, and revenues plateaued, and then started falling from 2015, first because of the VAT reform, 营改正, where the VAT was broadened to take in the service sector as well as the products, the goods sector, and it replaced the business tax, right? And in the process of reform, first of all, services are taxed at a much lower rate than goods in China. And the overall rate then was reduced. And the government made a number of concessions in broadening the tax base. And so the overall VAT rate was reduced significantly. And Lo Ziwei estimates that it cost the government about 2% of GDP in tax revenues from this one reform. And then there followed a series of tax cuts, starting with Trump 1.0 in 2016, trade tensions, economic growth slowed, and government started cutting taxes. And each year since then, they have been cutting taxes, year after year after year and after year, through 2024, and there will be tax cuts again in 2025. Okay. Now, by 2022, revenues had fallen to a level that is roughly the same as the revenue they collected in 2005. Okay, so that's, I drew a red line pointing across. So 2005, they collected about 16.5% of GDP, I think. And in 2022, revenue was back to 16.5% or so. Okay. This is significant because 2005 was the year before a number of very large social protection programs were introduced that raised government expenditures. And some of these big programs are here, and I have their launch dates and the number of beneficiaries. You can see they made rural education free for everyone. Prior to that, in 1986, the education law called for all children in China to receive 9 years of education, right? 9 years of compulsory education. And yet, I was doing some work on this for the World Bank. At the time, even in as late as 2004, 1/3 of China's rural counties were not able to provide 9 years of education. Okay, these are, when I say 1/3 of the counties, these are the mountainous, more sparsely populated ones. So it's not 1/3 of the children were not able to get it, but 1/3 of the counties were not able to provide 9 years of schooling. And then in these counties, many kids were not able to go to school because their parents could not afford to pay the fees associated with sending them to school. Okay, so finally in 2006, they made it free for everyone. And then they began thereafter to raise the standard of government subsidy to schools to improve the standard. So 2006, 2007, they introduced the 生均经费补贴. I forget the exact name, but every child in school receives a subsidy from the fiscal system. Okay, and then there's revenue sharing, cost sharing between the central and local governments about who pays for that. So this is the minimum, that's the national minimum, and of course local governments can top up to that. Large numbers of beneficiaries. We have some health experts sitting among us, and they know about the rural cooperative medical scheme that was introduced in the wake of SARS. And then the standards of subsidies were built up very rapidly in the early years. So that government is providing subsidies to get people to sign up for these health insurance programs. And then the rural minimum income guarantee, DBAO, first in the urban sector and then in the rural sector. Then you have, I was doing some field work in Henan in 2004 or 5. And the word came that Wen Jiabao has promised that all farmers are going to receive a pension. It's going to be a universal rural pension. And, people who turn 60 will start receiving a government pension, even though they haven't contributed anything to the program. So this was built up, over a period of 2 or 3 years. These are big programs that the government began to fund because the government had so much money coming in, 20% annual increase in revenues. And I was working for the World Bank at the time, and my friends in the Ministry of Finance kept saying to me, we have so much money coming in, we can't spend it fast enough. So this was a great period of introducing new programs and new initiatives. This is the curve. The red line is government expenditures. Okay, you can see that in 2005, revenues were 16.7%, expenditures were 17.9%, and from there it grew to 25%. So roughly increased by 7% with the introduction of those big programs. By the way, those programs were introduced in the late noughties. And the expenditures grew very fast at the beginning. So for five or 6 years, the per person expenditure was increasing very fast. Since then, it's been pretty flat, very small increases. And this is because revenues started slowing down and put increasing strain on the fiscal system. I'm going to talk about later on why 2021 marks a sharp break. You see the expenditures dropping really sharply at that point. And for those who look at land, certain people in this room would know why 2021's an important year. Okay, for the fiscal system as a whole, there was a pivot to land. Land has long been the key source of financing for capital spending in China. So China began to urbanize in the 1990s when China's, the previous period of fiscal decline was occurring, so government revenues fell from 30% of GDP at the beginning of reform in 1978 to 10% of GDP in 1996. So 1994 was the 分税制, the tax sharing system reform, but it took 2 years before the system began to, yield additional revenues. From 1996 to 2012, you have this steep upward curve, and then I said there was this downturn. But during that time, everything was decentralized, including capital spending. City governments were sitting there with no subsidies from higher level governments and facing people coming in. They need schooling, they need housing, they need, health care, they need all kinds of facilities. And they had to find ways to pay for that. And they turned to land as a resource. I was already working on China's fiscal system at the time, and there were discussions about who owns land. It's state-owned. What is state? Is it center? Is it province? Is it? So there were these negotiations along the way. But essentially, land became a local government resource. Andy works on this. And on municipal finance, this became a very important source of capital funding for local governments to use for paying for infrastructure, right? From the 1990s onward. And in the 1990s, local governments were not allowed to borrow. I almost got fired from the World Bank because the Ministry of Finance rejected a proposal. My entire work program for the year was cut out because the Ministry of Finance said, we don't need this study because we know what Christine Wong is going to come in to tell us, that local governments need to be allowed to borrow. And we don't need to hear that. So I had to find something else to do very quickly. And so they were borrowing off budget through local government financing vehicles, LGFVs. In 2015, fast forwarding, the revised budget law finally allowed local governments to borrow and gave them some legal instruments for doing so. But local governments continued to borrow off budget, and I will explain that later, how that happened. Okay, local governments turned in 2015, when revenues started falling relatively, local governments turned to land. You see the rise of land revenues as a share of GDP coincides neatly with the decline of the tax revenues to GDP, because local governments needed a supplementary source of revenue. Now, land was confined to being used as capital spending. It doesn't mean that they didn't divert some of it for recurrent spending, but not very large amounts without getting into trouble. But the budget law also changed something else. They called for called for more comprehensive use of fiscal resources, including land, and local governments were able to draw on land revenues and other fund revenues to supplement the budget. And the finance minister, Liu Kun, said, when land revenues started falling, he said, don't worry, it's only 15% of land revenues that are being used to supplement government spending. So this is a graph I constructed from what they call transfers from reserves and other budgets. But really, it's land. That's the only thing that's available, aside from carryovers from the year before, as a share of local government expenditures. You see that it rises to 9%. They were drawing more and more from land revenues to supplement spending because the budget was falling. And then land started declining after the three red lines. First, there was COVID. Okay, it peaked in 2019, and then COVID slowed down the land revenues. And then 2021, you have a big drop. And then you have some increases at the very end, and I can explain that too later. How the fiscal decline affected central and local governments? It didn't affect just local governments. First, of course, it affected local governments. When the social protection programs came in, all of these were local government responsibilities. So you see the local government share of total spending going up from 65% of the total to 85% of the total, ending by 2011. Okay, but the revenues went up a little bit, but not nearly enough, so the gap became bigger. Now, this is not showing expenditure needs. This is showing actual expenditure, right? So the gap is fully funded, and it's funded by transfers from the central government. And this is what happens to central government revenues. I took a shorter time period here. From 2015, central government was turning over 80% of its revenues in intergovernmental transfers to finance local government expenditures. And then came 2019 with jumping up to, in 2020, it turned over 100% of its revenues because of COVID. Revenue collection was very slow in the first half of the year, and local governments were really struggling, and central government had to step up. And then they tried to pull back in 2021, but by 2022, they had to turn over all of their revenues again. So since then, essentially, the central government is turning over all of its revenues to local governments in transfers and financing itself through deficit spending. And each year in 2020, there was the 2个亿万亿, so 2 extra trillion yuan, one extra trillion in deficit and another in special treasury bond. In 2022, they called in extra remittances from the central bank and from the tobacco and liquor lobbies, companies and so on. And so the central government's been struggling to find ways to finance its obligations in transfers. But at the same time, you saw the expenditure curve that had been falling from 2015. And here's what it looks like when you disaggregate to individual spending items. These are the main ones. So overall, general budget expenditure. This is government spending on operations of government and services. Okay, that fell from 25% of GDP to 21% of GDP. And education went from 3.7 to 3.1, with a big drop after 2020 to 2021. So, as a public finance budgeting person, I look at this and I despair because the cuts are roughly across the board. It's not very strategic. It's just that everybody's getting cut. This is the same thing as what happened in 1990s, all over again. So you have education where the government says, we want to spend 4% of GDP on education, and they have really only reached 4% by pulling in school revenues and many other things. So if you look at, there are different series of data on education, and I've had many debates with people. They have never reached 4% of GDP in public spending, and they're getting further and further away from that. Environmental protection is one of Xi Jinping's 3 big targets, and that's being cut, and everything else. And we also have data from the grassroots, a survey by the think tank, the MOF think tank, the Academy of Fiscal Sciences, that's never been published. This is the data, this quote comes from a Caixin magazine article citing this survey, but I've never been able to get a hold of this survey. But it says essentially that a lot of local governments, county level governments, are admitting that they leave a considerable portion of policy mandates unmet because of funding shortages. The NPC's 财政小组 or 财政委, whatever they're called, the Economic and Finance Committee that audits budget implementation each year, also back in 2022 said there is significant concern that grassroots governments face unfunded mandates and funding shortages. By grassroots, they mean county level governments. Okay, to the debt crisis. So as local governments face a fiscal crunch that goes on year after year and is worsening, and then you hit 2022 with zero COVID year, economic growth grinds to basically a halt, and toward the end of the year, they said 2.2% growth. Revenues were falling steeply. I think also 2022 was the year when the government paid back a lot of the VAT rebates that had been withheld. That's another story where they screwed up the VAT reform. And the government is sitting on several trillion yuan of taxpayer money that they haven't refunded because of interjurisdictional conflicts, because of poor bookkeeping and the difficulty of sharing VAT and so on. But in that year, they gave back 4 trillion yuan in VAT rebate. And that devastated revenue collection for many local governments, because it's not money that comes from Beijing in trucks so that local governments can hand it out to businesses. It's to be deducted from the taxes they are collecting, which means that they were collecting a hell of a lot less that year than before. And then you have the housing market that's really grinding to a halt because nobody's getting credit to build, and people were not getting flats that they paid for, and people are not buying flats because they can see that this is a pretty big gamble to put your money down for developments that may or may not happen, right? So this was really starting to hit hard, and local governments were really building up a lot of very, very high dependence on taxes. It's not just land revenues. They depend on real estate companies to pay VAT. The stamp tax on a transaction of apartments being bought and sold, you pay a stamp tax. And when you have housing market that's booming, you have furniture businesses, you have renovation businesses, etc. So this is a huge portion of China's GDP that's being hit very hard. So, and then you have collapse of land revenues. And also you have local governments were hitting a peak repayment period. I think Lo Jiwei was speaking around 2020 that local governments were going to be facing about 3 to 5 years of peak repayment that they had to watch out for. And it came, and there were defaults starting not on bonds, but on these non-bond kinds of debt, starting in 2021, picking up in 2022, and then and so on. And then also, there's been a deleveraging campaign underway since 2018 that's been fairly quiet. But I went to Hangzhou in 2021, early 2022, and the Municipal Finance Bureau said they were really worried because as one of the rich provinces, Hangzhou was supposed to have, so you have zero COVID, you have zero hidden debt, that the target was to be met in 2024. And, the woman who was briefing us said, that's a year and a half from now. There's no way we can do this. So we're hoping for an extension. So this was underway. And finally, the government rolled out a debt resolution package in 2023. And I've written about this. Almost none of the documents of what the government was doing is published. This is the new China where much of the work of governance has moved from the government structure to the party structure. So when it's a party organization that's issuing the regulation, it's not published, it's secret. Right? and so, I have to read a lot of WeChat, chatter to try to get a sense of what's happening. And then eventually somebody writes up something, an explainer. So I wrote a paper. It took me about a year to piece together what was happening. So there's a package where essentially the Ministry of Finance allowed local governments to use some of the unused bond quotas to repay LGFV debt. and the banks were pressured to roll over and restructure the LGFV debt and so on. And then the State Council said all parties should come together and make sure that nobody defaults through 2025. I think it's now been extended. And so this is a sovereign guarantee, right? So the debt risks disappeared, and everybody's happy. And the Ministry of Finance thinks that the problem is solved for the time being. And then they realize that, well, maybe the time being is not good enough. So at the end of 2024, they wrote out yet another debt package. And this is even more confusing. There are three numbers that the finance minister wrote out: 6 trillion, 10 trillion, and 12 trillion. I don't have time to talk about that, but you can ask questions, but let me go on. For those of you who are not familiar with Chinese local government debt, there are two types of debt. Well, there are many types, but two broad categories. You have legal debt. This is official debt that is on the books. It's reported, on the Ministry of Finance website and on all the local government websites and so on. And there are two types of debt: general debt and special project or product, 专项, special debt. So two different kinds of bonds, right? And when they issued them, they said general bonds are the general obligations of government. They will be repaid from general revenues. And these are to be used to cover an approved deficit of government and public infrastructure that does not generate any revenue returns. So if you build a school, public school, that's not going to generate any revenues. That should be financed by general bonds. Special bonds are those that will be self-financing, essentially. So these are for projects that have cost recovery, potential, so that the revenues coming in can now service the debt. And they are counted as government debt. They don't go on the government deficit because these are not future obligations of government general revenues. This is technical. You don't need to pay too much attention. And then, aside from official debt, local governments have a lot of unofficial debt, right? So you have LGFV debt that is off the books. It's on the LGFV books, but not on the government books. And there's always insistence that these are not public sector. They are private sector, and the government is not responsible for them. When in fact, what they're doing is government work. Do I? Oh, did I? Sorry. Okay. So this is I'm using IMF figures. There are lots of other figures, but I think the consensus is roughly around 66 trillion yuan in LGFV debt. This is estimate based on bonds that LGFVs issue, and when you issue bonds, you have to have public financial accounts that talk about your financial status. So it's not just the bonds, but what other things does this company owe, right? So that this is adding up those and projecting, LGFV bond issuing companies to all of LGFV. So this is essentially LGFV debt. In addition to that, just in going to China and having casual conversation, I learned that the governments owe all kinds of people all kinds of money. So I went to visit Yiwu because I want to see these small items, Christmas toys and so on that are exported from China and how they are transacted. And a Zhejiang University student's mother hosted lunch, and we're just chatting, and she said, "Oh yeah, the city government owes me 43 million yuan because she's a developer. She said, I bought this piece of land from the city, and then, for a certain amount, 43 million yuan. And then the city said, well, we actually want to buy back the land from you because we have some other project that we want to do. So will you sell it back to us? And she said, okay, take it. And then they never paid her, So she paid them 43 million, but they never paid her back. And she said, I'm not too worried because, we do business over a long period of time. And I've heard subsequent stories of that. So lots of that. Now we're increasingly hearing that civil servants in some localities are told that they should go to the banks, take out personal loans if they want to be paid. Okay, so that because the government has run out of credit with the banks, and the government is trying to encourage consumer loans, thinking that this would be encouraging consumption. And so consumer loans have low interest. So civil servants should go and borrow the money on behalf of governments. And recently, one of my colleagues came back from a home visit and said that in his or his wife's county, the education bureau chief had to go down to the bank and take out a personal loan because the developer that had built the schools, it got tired of waiting a few years to be paid. And he said, I'm going to lock up the schoolyard. And if you want school to happen, pay up. And so the education bureau chief had to go and take out a loan and things like this. And yes, to get money to pay the developer. And so we don't have any accounts of what that number is. Okay, Li Daokui, who likes to give a lot of speeches, has been recently talking about 10%. The number is probably somewhere between 5 and 10% of GDP. It is a very big problem because the Li Qiang has talked about it several times. The State Council has called repeatedly for local governments to pay up their the pay arrears, because this is kind of gumming up the whole system. When nobody's getting paid, you don't want to make investments, you don't pay your workers. And so, of course, before Chinese New Year, there's always a big push to make sure that everybody is paid so they can go home. And then in talking to local officials unofficially, we know that the accounts are really messy. So any kind of reserves in Social Security funds are not going to be sitting there for very long when everybody is starved for money. Okay, so you have the official debt, you have the unofficial, kind of open debt, and then you have all these unaccountable informal debts. The debt resolution plan. How much time do I have? Okay, what the government wants to do in this resolution plan is bring hidden debt out into the open, bring it onto the local government balance sheet, okay, so that they know how much there is, and then to ban, additional borrowing off budget. And then the idea is that once it's all on the balance sheet, they can manage it in a unified way. And if they start behaving properly, they would have prudent management and not borrow more than they can afford, and so on. And then gradually, work down the debt over time. This is the idea. This is why this is nonsense. Because if you look at the official debt, this is just the official debt. So was the left-hand graph that I showed you, but without distinguishing what kind of debt, general or special. And then dividing it by fiscal capacity. This is a debt metric that the government uses. Okay, the amount of resources available to local government in any given year is their general revenues, their fund revenues, which is almost 100% land, and then transfers from central government. Okay, if you take fiscal capacity and divide by the debt, existing debt, it's already at 201% projected for this year. And the red line that MOF set for this ratio, this metric, was 120%. This is just at the beginning of bringing the hidden debt onto the balance sheet. Okay, so that the blue bars are growing very fast, partly because of the bringing on some of the hidden debt. 2 trillion has been brought on since 2023. And this is going to go up faster as they go forward with this debt resolution plan. There's no room to take on this debt. Moreover, the single biggest driver of local government debt is investment in infrastructure, right? And over the past 3 decades, local governments are building 70 to 90% of all infrastructure without much help from the central government. And infrastructure is financed by debt, right? This is what public finance theory says you should do. It's both fair and efficient to borrow money to build long-term infrastructure that produces benefits over a long period of time so that the users will pay. So when you borrow the money, you pay back gradually. So future taxpayers will be sharing the cost of building this bridge today or this subway system today. It's not fair for today's taxpayers to pay the whole bill. So debt finance is correct and efficient for infrastructure finance. And local governments are doing this, and they have not been given the right instruments. And the government, in addition, China is an outlier in infrastructure development because they keep using it for stimulus. China is an investment-driven model, and they continue to drive economic growth with investments. And this is local government funded. So this is, largely an unfunded mandate. And then if you look at the financing structure of infrastructure. So I've taken the investment in infrastructure and taken 80% of it, estimated, local government share. And I take the approved bond quotas each year. This is what the NPC determines is the appropriate level of borrowing by local governments. And there's a huge gap between what they're investing and what the instruments available give them. And so the assumption has always been that it's partly using land revenues and partly using other, leveraging private investment, which has not been very successful. We have business school people who can explain this to us. So the structure is loading up local governments with debt and scolding them for borrowing too much. Okay, let me sum up. So my argument in this paper is that China has suffered through a decade, going back to 2015, we're in 2025 now, a decade of erosion of the fiscal system, decline in the general budget, led to first turning to land. And then when land started to collapse, turning to debt and off-budget finance, debt financing. if you remember back to the graph where I showed how much was local governments were drawing from other budgets, i.e. land revenues, to finance general expenditures, it rose 9% and then dropped from 2021 on to 3-4%, and then jumped in 2024, 2025. The reason for that jump was not because land recovered. It's because the central government is now borrowing money through what is called special treasuries. And rather than putting them with government's general debt and deficit, they're starting to park this money in the government fund budget. So it's not counted anywhere. And they're using it to finance local governments via the government fund channel. Right. And so this is what I've just finished a paper on looking at the 2025 budget, and finally I'm figuring out some of these things. The government they created the SPBs, the special bonds, with this idea that this is a kind of debt that would be self-financing and would not be calling on the fiscal system itself. And now this year, starting last year, actually, the central government is borrowing money and putting it on. They don't call it special project bonds, they call them central treasuries. But this is central government using the same instrument to finance general government. So this is kind of a hidden debt. And they, furthermore, because the debt resolution campaign is really failing, it's not doing what it needs to do, the government is allowing local governments to use some of the SPBs to take up the hidden debt and to finance general expenditures. Because there are three things that the governments say is the bottom line. It's the sanbao, right? The three guarantees that must be met. And that is guaranteeing payroll, guaranteeing sufficient money for operations of government, normal operations of government, and then 基本民生, the basic services. So education, health, a few other pensions. Many local governments are unable to meet the sanbao. And the central government has run out of money to provide more transfers. And so you have this is adding up all the deficits across 4 budgets. There's actually one budget that's in surplus. That's the state asset operating income. But that's really tiny. That's a little gray thing above the zero line. But everything else is in the blue bar is the deficit on the general budget.
The gray is the STASAC? It's the SOEs, the STASAC?
Yeah. And then you have these numbers are adjusted to take out the double counting. So from the general budget, there's a subsidy that goes to the Social Security budget, which funds roughly a quarter of Social Security spending. So I take that out of the general budget expenditure because it's spent in the Social Security budget, right? And so once you take out the subsidy from the revenues of the Social Security fund, the Social Security budget is in deficit. And that's the yellow bar. Okay, and the yellow bar is going to be growing very fast because China has a bulge of people over 60 coming online. This is a scary picture. The government is running deficits. This is a consolidated deficit over 4 budgets. In 2025, according to the budget that they made, will be 8.8% of GDP in deficit. This is bigger than even in 2020. So when they say we're rolling out this big deficit spending stimulus, it's true. It's the biggest ever. But it's funded by debt. Now, just to finish up, this is not a local government problem. This is a whole of government problem, right? It's a systemic problem. And they need to fix the aggregate fiscal gap by building a new tax system. We can spend an hour talking about the tax system and what can be fixed. But just to summarize, they need to find this replacement. They began relying on this unsustainable source of finance for too many years, and now it's gone. The housing market will recover at some point to some level, but it's not going to go back to and it shouldn't go back to the speculative heights that it reached. And so there will be, at the peak, they were collecting almost 9% of GDP in land revenue. That's an overestimate of resources available because that's the gross receipt and not net receipt. But there's going to be a gap that they need to fill with something else. They need to stop making local governments carry out macro stabilization functions. This is nuts. There's no other country that I know of that assigns this function to local governments. Because local governments are supposed to run balanced budgets, they can't print money. Only the national government can print money. They need to find a more efficient and sustainable level of infrastructure investment, right? And assign it to central and provincial governments. None of these changes are going to be quick or easy, especially when economic growth is slow. And it's absolutely urgent in the short term for China to roll out a big stimulus to avoid falling into a Japan-style trap. So China is in a really bad place before Donald Trump started hitting them with these completely ruinous tariffs. So let me end there. Try to beat that.
We're always having a contest of who can be more pessimistic. Xu Lao Shi, I don't know. Okay, I'll leave it on the table. All right, so I just want to make one note, which is a bit of an accusation, which is that Fitch downgraded China's, and they quoted a long-term structural erosion of the revenue position. Mm-hmm. And so you might directly blame Professor Wang's papers for that particular downgrade. I have a quick question of fact, which I want you to answer in like one word, which is my favorite thing I've ever learned from you, one of my favorite things. How many people in the Ministry of Finance are working on local government debt?
Probably 3.
Okay, so with that, a more substantive question, which is that you ended in a very pessimistic position and said basically there's an urgent need for reform, right? And the relevant phrase might be 相势必然, So, and I hear this over and over again from Chinese interlocutors, which is basically the circumstances will force them to do it this year. And so we have a situation where there's external threat, there's a deep need to project resolve. And I guess I want to speculate. I mean, you've been looking at local finances and public finances for 40 years.
Not yet.
Almost. But you've seen a lot of change. And usually the change comes from emergency and pressure. And so are we likely to see a radical reform of the public finance system in China? And what would that look like, right? So, a property tax doesn't seem likely at a moment of deflation in the property sector. So what would be if they said, okay, we want to do 1 and 2 and the rest of it, what would you recommend that they do, and what's the relative probability that they undertake those things politically?
Yes, I think reform, in theory, reform is easier when things are going well, but nobody ever is motivated to do reform when things are going well. And actually, we had a closed-door discussion about 15 years ago in the Ministry of Finance and Tsinghua, and Luo Jiwei was there, and Xiang Huaicheng was there, these finance ministers. And Luo Jiwei said, no, we're not going to do reform because, nobody feels any urgency at the moment. So that was, I think that was probably 2000. I was still at Oxford, so 2005, maybe. 20 years ago, wow. And I asked him, what about local government debt? Is that a crisis that's going to force the government to do something? And he said, no, that's completely controllable. And as we were walking out to lunch, Xiang Huaicheng said to me, actually, he's overconfident. And things got much worse, of course. But there is recognition, finally, that there's a systemic problem, not just a local government misbehavior. For a very long time, that the prevailing sentiment was that this is a moral hazard problem. The Central Finance is not going to do anything about this because until we can make sure that local governments behave better. And so if you go back to the 2014 reform, at the beginning of the Xi Jinping administration, they laid out 3 phases of reform. First phase would be public financial management reform to build up accountability systems to gauge what local governments are doing and hold them accountable before the next step of turning over resources to them. And in the meantime, they were going to do some tax reform that would give local governments more revenue resources. So property tax was one. Resource tax was another, where they were going to make the resource tax a more efficient lever for resource allocation, as well as turning it over to local governments. And none of those things happened. And then it was, when all of these were done, so accounting systems are in place. At the beginning, really the accounting systems were very crude. You have these tiny little forms with very little information that's asked of local governments. And now they, introduce accrual accounting. They have multiple new sets of tables, and they have inspections. You have audits. You have internal audits. They gave the audit commission a lot more power to audit the budget, and they do it now regularly and at all levels of government. They require transparency. Local governments have to put their budgets on the web within 30 days of their People's Congress approval. So there's a lot of information available on the budget, on the general budget. And they were to gradually extend control over the other budgets. And that hasn't quite happened. So the government fund budget, which is the earmarked fees that different agencies collect. So there used to be an airport fee. Remember, we used to have to go buy a different chip. It's now folded into your ticket price, and it's still a fee, and that goes into the government budget, fund budget. Sorry. So there are about 24 funds that are in the fund budget plus land, and they've canceled some, overlaps and so on, trying to clean that up. But there's no accounting for how that money is used. Whereas the general budget now, you get at the central government level about 2,000 items, 2,000 lines of how the money is spent. If you can find how much money goes to the Communist Party and how much goes to Zheng Xie and other parties and so on. You can find how much goes to national defense, although that's not broken down. That's just one line. But education huge number of lines, how much goes to this kind of education, that kind of education, etc. So a lot better accounting, a lot better inspection, but there's no money. The amount of resources going to local governments remains unchanged. So the changes are, and I think this typifies kind of the Xi Jinping era, where it's all about controls, more and more controls, but no incentives. The resources have not changed. And so you don't get any improvements in local government finance. And then on the issue of the fiscal erosion, I don't think that the Ministry of Finance understands this yet. Or either if they do, they're not allowed to talk about it. The other parts of government don't understand. So in the third plenum last year, July, they talked about, I've been having arguments within EAI about whether there's going to be fiscal reform or not. And I say no. And Bert Hoffman says, yes, yes, yes. And Alfred Schipka also says yes. And they said we're going to have fiscal reform. Do they talk about taxes? Do they talk about the need to bring more revenue? They talk about, giving local governments more revenue sources. By doing what? Giving them more part of the consumption tax? That's just peanuts. It's not going to make much difference. The different ways of thinking about how to raise tax revenues. This is a bad time to be talking about it when the economy is slow. And government is much happier giving tax breaks than to raise taxes. But eventually, they're going to have to do it. They should have done it when things were not as bad, but they will have to do it at some point. This year, the revenues will fall to 15.5% of GDP if they meet the budget. And they haven't been able to deliver the budget. That's the other thing. Since 2019, they have not been able to deliver the budget that is formulated and presented in March. Expenditures have always fallen short. And I track it month by month. It gets shorter, it falls shorter and shorter. And then in December, suddenly it catches up a little bit, so that it doesn't look so bad at the end. But all it means that it gets carried over to the next year because money is not really spent. So December gets 2.5 times the monthly allocation. Maybe it goes to year-end bonuses or something, but they've had trouble delivering the budget.
Maybe we have 5 minutes, so enough time for maybe 2 questions. So Andy and Liam.
I sort of have 3 questions. But
you
can't think of all the time.
Sorry.
The whole time.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll be very quick. Can you centralize local debt about 80%, put it on the central government balance sheet? But a lot of people say you can do that. That does not answer the question about raising tax revenue unless you reform the state system and banking system. That's the first question. Second question is, at what point is the non-payment of local salaries going to create protests that will force the center to reform?
And then maybe we'll let Liam ask a question real quickly too, and then Christine, you can wrap up.
Yeah, thank you. So, quick question. You talk about fiscal policy. What kind of monetary policy should be, placed here to support, fix the system or address the system?
Well, let me take this one first. I don't want to take up monetary policy because I have not. This is not my strong point, and I think that there's been more in terms of the fiscal and monetary working together. They are trying to coordinate on the debt resolution, and all that means is that each party gets hit over the head again and again to do their share, and they do not even coordinate on that level. Okay. And then this year, 500 billion yuan is going to go to the 6 largest commercial banks to prop up their balance sheets. But they don't need it. They don't need it yet. Actually, their balance sheets look pretty good. It is to pay them off for absorbing a lot of the LGFV debt that's coming through. And Andy's question, remind me again on the first one.
Centralizing debt and social.
Centralizing debt. Okay, centralizing debt is very easy. Yes, it can be done. Because if you look at the amount of, if you look at the balance sheets, central government's balance sheet is beautiful. It's below 30% of debt to GDP. Okay, local governments have 120% debt to GDP ratio. Central government has 30%. So you can move 90% over to the central government and make them 120%. That's still below the average for the advanced countries. So yes, absolutely, they can do it. Should they do it? They're not going to do it because there's the moral hazard problem that they can't get over.
Social unrest. Social unrest.
Do they pay the soldiers? That's my question. Do they pay their retired PLA?
This is what I'm trying to start collecting information on. There are some scattered reports that people are not receiving their full pensions, or they're not getting their pensions on time. Okay, but pensions are still, because one of my colleagues says they can't not pay pensions because immediately the retirees will be out in the streets. And so I think, they have a priority list of who's more likely to create social problems and pay them off first. But ultimately, they're going to run into problems. You can't suppress that many protests all over the place all at once. So I've been saying reform is urgent for 3 years. Eventually, I'm going to be proven right that they will do something. But so far, in the 2025 budget, they did run a bigger deficit than before. And the central government did take up a slightly larger share of the debt issuance.
Like a 4% deficit or something.
4% deficit, that's on the general budget. Right. The overall budget deficit at 8.8%, according to my calculations, up to 10% by other people's calculations. And they're leaning very heavily into debt. So between year-end 2024 and 2025, they will have added 18.2% of GDP in debt in 2 years. So they're adding 9% per year to debt. And they can do it because the central government balance sheet is not that bad. This is not a long-run solution. They are clearly on a fiscally unsustainable path. It's just how much longer they want to go down that road.
I think on that note, I'll remind all of you who celebrate that your taxes are due in a few days in the United States, if you pay them. But we are very lucky to have you to learn this much about the situation in China. And please join me in thanking Professor Christine.
And by the way, in China, about only 5% of people pay personal income tax, right?